That summer, we carried a chipped glass jar into the meadow behind the church and caught fireflies while grandmother told us about the old days. The jar hummed with our small, bright mistakes, and every sudden glow made a hush between us, as if the night itself paused to listen. The air smelled of warm dust, of lilac that had given up its scent to the heat, of a distant rain that hadn't yet decided whether to come. It was the season when the world seemed to widen a little, as if someone had slipped a lid off a too small pot and let the bright hours spill out. We were all a little taller in those days, or perhaps it only felt that way because the days stretched on forever. The meadow lay flat and forgiving, a green plain that stretched to the line of trees where the road forgot to end. The church beside it wore its weathering like a shawl, small, faithful, always there. In the air, the sound of cicadas made the ground hum under our feet, and somewhere a saw cut through the heat in a neighbour's yard, a rhythmic reminder of hands that kept the day moving, even when the sun pressed hard on the back of your neck. Grandmother walked with us, though she moved slower than we did, and watched with eyes that seemed to carry their own soft interior light. She wore a dress that was patterned with small, careful flowers and an apron that smelled of starch and lavender. She wore a necklace of beads that clicked softly whenever she leaned to listen to one of our questions, as if the beads themselves kept the memory in order. She did not hurry us along, but she did pull us back when we started to race after a bright scatter of fireflies, as if to remind us to look up from the ground long enough to notice the shape of the world above our feet. We came to that jar as if it were a small sacred thing, which in truth it was to me even if I did not yet know why. It was just a jar, a thing you could drop and shatter on a kitchen floor, and fear would live there in the broken glass. But this jar was different when the sun went lower and the air cooled enough to make the mint green of the meadow glow. We gathered the fireflies, tapping against the glass, as though the tiny lamps could be coaxed to stay with us, to tell us something we could take home. When the lid clicked on, the glow pressed faintly upward in the amber glow of dusk, and the world looked a little kinder, a little more possible. Grandmother spoke softly, as if she were weaving a tale in threadbare velvet that would hold us in one place just long enough to listen. She did not speak loudly, but every syllable felt full, as though she had weighed each word on a careful scale before offering it to the air. She told us about the old days, about when there were no electric lights to chase away the night, about a girl who walked to the river with a tin cup to fetch water and came back with stories of frogs that wore gold crowns in the mud, of women who kept time in their hands by sewing and kneading and singing. Her voice did not pretend that life was simple or fair. It sang instead of resilience, of endurance, of finding a way to trust the next breath even when the day proved stubborn. I did not yet know what it meant to trust a breath. I only knew the river in our village had a taste, a coppery sting that clung to your lips if you stood too close to the water and stretched your neck toward the surface to see if there was anything else alive in its depth. The river ran behind the trees, through the hollow where the wind learned to sound like a piano. The fireflies' glow braided with the light of the far-off lamps from the houses on the hill, and the distant ring of a bell from the churchyard seemed to come back in a circle, hour after hour, a patient drumbeat telling us to stay, to listen, to become quiet enough to hear what the world was whispering. Grandmother's stories did not erase the ache of a world that could be unkind or hard. If anything, they made the ache more living, more honest in its shapes. She spoke of people who had to learn gentleness the hard way. The grandmother who saved a child from a summer storm by lifting him onto her knees and letting his tears dry on her apron. The old man who walked miles to mend a neighbour's fence and walked back with the knowledge that his own hands could be used to mend something else if someone would grant him a chance. She never spoke as though the past was a perfect photograph. She spoke as though memory were a daily habit, something you practiced like bowing to the altar of ordinary life. As we listened, the jar grew heavier in my hand, as if the light inside it was choosing to settle rather than leap. The moment felt like a hinge in time, a quiet turning where the future could slip in or slide away, depending on how we held on to the present. I learned something then about the slow, stubborn brightness that lives in small acts, the patience of a grandmother who does not rush a grandchild through a lesson, the careful way a child asks a question and waits for the answer, even if the answer is simply the sound of a night creature calling from somewhere beyond the trees. The air began to cool, as if the day itself exhaled, relieved to end properly after such a long, sun-heavy stretch. The fireflies flickered in their jar, and then surfaced again on the edge of the lid, a halo of light that moved like a living constellation. I looked up at the sky, a tender quilt of lavender and pale gold, and for the first time I understood why people spoke of the night as both stranger and friend. The stars did not scold you for being small. They offered a timeless company, a sense that you belong to something larger than your fear or your plans. In that moment, I felt as if I understood what it might mean to become one of the people who held light for others, even when their own hands trembled. When we carried the jar back to the kitchen that night, something in me shifted, or perhaps something in the world shifted around me. The kitchen smelled of bread and simmering soup, a scent that always felt like a warm embrace when the day finally paused its spinning. Grandmother set the jar on the windowsill where the late sun could cross it, refolding the day into a private memory to be kept there until morning. She did not scold us for letting the light spill beyond its small prison. If anything, she smiled with that quiet smile I learned to trust, a smile that said the world would hold and be held in return. That was the first time I learned to keep a moment, not just live inside it. I kept the fireflies. Glow in memory as much as in the jar, carried it through the years like a lantern that never quite burned out. I learned to listen for the sound of the world's small urgencies, the soft creak of a chair when someone sits to ask for help, the rustle of dry leaves on a windy afternoon, the murmur of a mother's voice telling a child that the world is not a place to fear when you walk with it slowly and honestly. I learned that patience is not merely the absence of noise. It is the presence of care that remains, even as the day ends and the night presses its soft questions upon you. In the years that followed, I found myself in rooms and towns far from that meadow. Yet the memory of that summer stayed with me like a quiet compass. I became a person who valued the ordinary, not because I could tell grand stories about it, but because I learned to let the ordinary unfold at its own pace, and to treasure the small lights that appear when you least expect them. I learned to listen, not just with my ears, but with my heart, the way a child listens for a mother's voice, the way an old man learns to hear the phrase that means you are not alone. The memory taught me that to be human is to be a caretaker of light, to pass it along the chain of years so that it is not extinguished when our own hands grow tired. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, I can still smell the kitchen, the bread cooling on a rack, the faint sweetness of something baked that I cannot name anymore, the iron tang of the river lingering in the room's corners. The jar is gone now, and the meadow is different under new families and new prayers. But the story remains, tucked behind the doors of memory, a gentle map of how to live a life that matters in its softness. I do not pretend to have walked only through good days. I have learned to carry a kind of tenderness that does not demand applause. It is enough to know that a light was kept, even if the world forgets occasionally how to name it. If you asked me what that evening gave me, I would say it gave me a vocabulary for praise. The words to describe the way a child's breath fogs in the cold air of a late possible night. The way a grandmother's hands can seem to measure out courage as surely as she measures flour. It taught me that gratitude is not the grand gesture of a single moment, but the willingness to return to it again and again in the quiet hours of ordinary days. The memory taught me that love is a careful craft, something you shape over time with your hands, your listening, your patient, steady presence. And so I've spent many years trying to be worthy of the light those fireflies blessed me with that long summer evening. I cannot promise that I always found it, or that the world is always kind to those who carry a light in their pockets. But I know this: time passes, and the days kilt toward night as surely as leaves turn toward autumn.